I was halfway through a home improvement project when my neighbor, Kevin, knocked on my door. Normally, Kevin's visits meant borrowing tools or complaining about the state of his lawn, so I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. But this time, he had a strange look on his face, somewhere between pity and hesitation. "Hey, Matt," he started, scratching the back of his neck. Can I talk to you for a second?" It's about Diane." Those words alone were enough to set my heart racing. Diane, my wife, was always the picture of perfection in our neighborhood. She was charming, funny, and had this way of making everyone feel like they were the center of the universe. I couldn't imagine what Kevin, of all people, could have to say about her. "Sure," I said, wiping my hands on my jeans and stepping onto the porch. Kevin glanced around, making sure no one else was listening, before he leaned in closer. "I wasn't sure if I should say anything," he began, lowering his voice. "But I saw her last night, at that new bar downtown, Luna's. She wasn't alone, Matt. And, they didn't look like old friends catching up." I froze, the words hitting me like a brick to the chest. "Are you sure it was Diane?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. Kevin nodded. "Positive." I didn't mean to spy or anything, but it was pretty obvious. They were laughing, touching each other real close. "I thought you should know." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. My gut reaction was to brush it off. Kevin could be a little nosy, prone to exaggeration. But there was something in his eyes, something genuine, that told me he wasn't making this up. "Thanks for letting me know," I said finally, not really sure what else to say. Kevin gave me a pat on the shoulder, then walked back to his house, leaving me standing there, stunned. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake the thought, convincing myself it was a misunderstanding. Diane had mentioned a work dinner last night. Maybe she ran into someone afterward. Maybe Kevin was just mistaken. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, doubt lingered like a shadow. That night, as Diane came home, I watched her more closely than usual. She greeted me with her usual warmth, kissed me on the cheek, and went straight to the kitchen to pour herself a glass of wine. Her casual demeanor should have put me at ease, but instead, it made me even more suspicious. "Good dinner last night?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She didn't miss a beat. "Yeah, it was fine. Just the usual work stuff." Her answer was so nonchalant, so perfectly rehearsed, that it only deepened the knot in my stomach. The next step was clear. I had to find out for myself. It started the following Saturday. Diane said she had a meeting with her work's regional team at the new downtown office and would be out for most of the day. The timing couldn't have been better for me to put my plan in motion. After Kevin's revelation, I didn't waste time. I spent 2 sleepless nights replaying everything in my head, torn between paranoia and cold determination. On Friday, I finally took action. I bought a GPS tracker, a compact little device that fit snugly under Diane's car. It wasn't cheap, but it felt necessary. If there was any truth to what Kevin had said, I couldn't let it slide. Saturday morning came, and Diane left at 9:30 a.m., dressed sharp but casual, dark jeans, a button-up blouse, hair tied back neatly. She kissed me goodbye, as she always did, and I couldn't help but notice her lingering glance, like she was checking my expression for something. I kept my cool and smiled, telling her to have a good day. The second her car disappeared down the street, I opened the app linked to the tracker. There was her dot, moving steadily away from our neighborhood. The first thing that caught my attention was her route. Diane worked west of our home, but she was driving east. Not a big deal, I told myself. Maybe she needed gas, or she was picking something up on the way. But as I watched her dot stop at a strip mall 10 miles out, my gut told me otherwise. I grabbed my jacket and keys, heading out the door. I didn't want to confront her immediately, not yet, but I needed to see what she was doing. It took me 20 minutes to get there, and when I pulled into the parking lot, I saw her car parked near a cafe. I stayed back, parking on the other side of the lot and keeping my distance. My heart pounded as I spotted her inside through the large glass windows. Diane wasn't alone. She was sitting at a table with a man I didn't recognize, and from what I could tell, they were deep in conversation. I studied the man, early 40s, neatly dressed, dark hair. He didn't seem particularly remarkable, but the way Diane leaned in toward him told me all I needed to know. Her body language was intimate, too intimate for a professional meeting. For over an hour, they stayed there, talking, laughing. At one point, she reached across the table and touched his hand, her fingers lingering just a little too long. That was it. I couldn't watch anymore. I drove home in a daze, alternating between fury and a kind of numb acceptance. Kevin was right. Something was happening, and it wasn't innocent. But I still didn't have the full picture, and I needed it. That night, Diane came home as if nothing had happened. She told me her meeting went well, even mentioning some fake detail about a team discussion on next quarter's targets. It took everything in me not to confront her right then. Instead, I smiled, nodded, and pretended to care. I wasn't done yet. The next weekend, Diane said she needed to attend a work seminar out of town. It didn't take a genius to figure out that this seminar was probably another excuse. This time, I was ready. I waited until she left early Saturday morning, and then I followed her. The tracker made it easy. She drove for about an hour, eventually pulling into a quaint bed and breakfast tucked away off the highway. My stomach dropped when I saw the man from the cafe standing outside, waiting for her. She got out of the car, smiling, and they embraced like lovers reuniting after months apart. It was surreal watching them check in together, laughing as they carried their bags inside. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the entrance, every nerve in my body on fire. Eventually, I got out. Not to confront her, not yet. I walked into the lobby under the pretense of being a guest looking for a room. The receptionist, a young woman with a cheery smile, greeted me warmly. "Do you have a reservation?" she asked. "No," I said, feigning casual interest. "Just passing through and thought I'd check it out." "Full house tonight?" "We've got a couple of rooms left," she said. "It's a quiet weekend, actually." I nodded, glancing at the sign-in sheet sitting on the counter. And there it was, Diane's name, scrawled in her unmistakable handwriting, right above the man's name. They were listed as sharing a room. "Thanks," I muttered, turning and walking out before I lost my nerve. I drove to a nearby diner and sat in a booth, ordering coffee I didn't want. My mind raced as I tried to decide what to do next. Should I storm back in and confront her? Call her out in front of everyone? Or should I wait, gather more evidence, and make sure she couldn't deny anything? By the time I finished my coffee, I had my answer. Later that night, I parked a short distance from the bed and breakfast, my phone in hand. I had rented a camera with a zoom lens earlier that week, just in case. Now, it came in handy. From the bushes, I snapped photos of Diane and the man through their window. They were sitting on the bed, talking, laughing. And then they kissed. It felt like watching a stranger. This wasn't the woman I married. I went home that night with the proof I needed. But instead of feeling triumphant, I felt hollow. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I spent Sunday preparing myself. Confronting Diane wasn't something I could just jump into. I needed to approach it carefully, coldly. There wouldn't be yelling or begging. She would have nowhere to run, no room to twist the truth into something I'd forgive. This would be surgical. I started by organizing everything: the photos from the bed and breakfast, the tracker logs showing her detours, the receipts from the cafe I found on her passenger seat months ago but thought nothing of at the time. All of it went into a folder I labeled "The Truth." When Diane returned Sunday night, I acted as though nothing had changed. I greeted her warmly, helped her bring her overnight bag inside, and asked if she wanted dinner. She seemed a little tired but happy, giving no sign that she suspected a thing. "Dinner sounds great," she said, slipping off her shoes. "How were things here?" "Quiet," I replied. "Kids stayed at their friends', so it was just me." "How was the seminar?" "Oh, same as always," she said with a shrug. "Boring presentations, bad coffee." It was remarkable how easily the lies came to her, the ease with which she carried on as though she hadn't just spent a weekend in bed with another man. I kept my expression neutral, nodded along to her small talk, and waited until after dinner to strike. We sat in the living room, Diane scrolling on her phone while I pretended to watch TV. My folder was on the coffee table, innocuous among the clutter of magazines and remote controls. "Diane," I said casually, turning to her. "We need to talk." She glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "Sure, what's up?" "About your seminar," I said. "And the man you spent it with." Her reaction was immediate, though she tried to mask it. Her body stiffened, and her hand froze mid-scroll. But her face quickly recovered, settling into a look of confusion. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice steady. I picked up the folder and handed it to her. "This." Diane hesitated, then took the folder. She flipped it open, her eyes scanning the contents. The tracker logs came first, showing her stops at the cafe and the bed and breakfast. Then the photos, crisp and damning, of her with the man. Her face went pale as she flipped through the pages. For a moment, she said nothing, staring at the evidence in her hands. "I can explain," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Go ahead," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Explain why you've been lying to me, to our family. Explain why you've been sneaking around with him." Her hands shook as she set the folder down. "It's not what it looks like." "Then what is it?" I asked, my voice calm. "Because it looks like you've been cheating on me." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't let myself feel sympathy. "Not yet." "It just happened," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I didn't plan it, Matt. We worked together, and it started with lunches, just talking, nothing serious. I didn't mean for it to go further, but it did," I finished for her. "You made that choice, Diane. Don't pretend this just fell into your lap." She flinched but didn't deny it. "I was lonely," she said softly. "You've been so distant lately, working all the time, barely talking to me. I felt invisible." "So you thought screwing someone else would fix that?" She winced again, her tears spilling over. "I'm sorry, Matt. I didn't want this to happen. I swear, it didn't mean anything. It was just an escape." I stared at her, feeling a cold fury settle in my chest. "An escape? From what? A marriage you never told me was broken? A life you never said you hated?" She shook her head, sobbing now. "I don't hate our life. I don't hate you. I love you, Matt. I've always loved you." "Funny way of showing it," I said, my voice sharp. Diane reached for me, but I leaned away. "Matt, please. We can fix this. I'll end it, I swear. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the quiet room. "Right? Diane, there's no fixing this. You don't just come back from something like this." She sobbed harder, her face crumpling. "I'll go to therapy. We can go to therapy. I'll quit my job if that's what you want. Please, Matt, don't give up on us." Her desperation should have moved me, but it only made me angrier. For months, she'd lied to me, betrayed me, and now she wanted me to believe she was suddenly willing to change. "Do you even hear yourself?" I asked, my voice low. "You want me to believe you're sorry, that you love me, after everything you've done. But you weren't thinking about me, or our kids, when you were with him, were you?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. I stood, towering over her. "We're done, Diane. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine." Her sobs filled the room as I walked away, leaving her alone with the folder. For the first time in years, I felt like I had control of my life again. I didn't sleep much that night. Diane cried herself to sleep in the guest room, and the house was eerily quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. The confrontation had been exhausting, but it was only the beginning. Now it was time to take control of the situation and make sure Diane truly understood the cost of her betrayal. When I woke up, I started planning. My first move was to contact my lawyer. I'd already had a consultation after Kevin tipped me off, but now it was time to make things official. By 9 a.m., I was in his office, laying out the evidence I had collected. "Matt, this is solid," he said, flipping through the folder. "The photos, the tracker logs. She won't have a leg to stand on in court." "That's the idea," I replied. "I want full custody of the kids and to protect every asset I can. She made her choice, now she can live with it." He nodded, scribbling notes on a legal pad. "We can push for an advantageous settlement, but be prepared, this will get messy. Especially with the kids involved." "I don't care how messy it gets," I said firmly. "I'm not backing down." The next step was practical. I began separating our lives. I contacted the bank and froze our joint accounts. I moved my money to a new account in my name only, ensuring Diane couldn't touch it. Then, I called the utility companies and changed the accounts into my name, effectively removing Diane's access to any household services. By mid-afternoon, I was at a locksmith's shop. I had every lock on the house rekeyed. Diane wouldn't be able to enter without my permission, and I planned to enforce that strictly. I didn't want her under the same roof anymore. That evening, Diane finally emerged from the guest room, her face red and swollen from crying. She looked like she hadn't slept, which was fine by me. "Matt," she said hesitantly, standing in the doorway of the living room. "Can we talk?" I didn't look up from the laptop I was working on. "We already talked." "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "I know I messed up, but we can work through this. I've been looking up therapists all day, there's a couple in town that specialize in marriage counseling." "Diane," I said flatly, closing the laptop and looking her dead in the eye. "There's no we anymore. I've already started the divorce process. You should start packing." Her face crumpled again, and she stepped closer. "Please, Matt. Don't do this. I'll leave him, I already told him it's over. I'll do anything. Just don't give up on us." "It's not just him," I said, standing up and towering over her. "It's the lies, the betrayal, the months you spent deceiving me and the kids. You didn't care about us then, why should I care now?" Her tears turned to anger. "You don't understand what it was like. I was lonely, Matt. You were always working, always distracted. Don't you dare blame this on me," I snapped. "You could have talked to me, but you didn't. Instead, you decided to sneak around behind my back like a coward. That's on you, not me." She opened her mouth to argue but stopped when she saw the cold look in my eyes. "I want you out by the end of the week," I said firmly. "If you're not, I'll have the police escort you out." She stared at me in shock, then stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The next few days were a blur of action. I took my evidence to the kids, sitting them down for a brutally honest conversation. I kept it as simple as I could, no need to drag them into every sordid detail, but I made sure they understood that Diane's actions had led us here. They were devastated, of course. My daughter sobbed, asking why her mom would do something like this. My son sat in silence, his face blank but his hands clenched into fists. "I'm sorry, kids," I said, my voice breaking despite my best efforts to stay composed. "This isn't what I wanted, but it's what has to happen. We'll get through this together, okay?" They nodded, though I could see the pain in their eyes. It broke me, but it also strengthened my resolve. Diane didn't just betray me, she betrayed them, too. On Wednesday, I took the final step in my revenge plan. I gathered all the evidence, the photos, the tracker logs, everything, and mailed copies to Diane's HR department. Her affair partner worked there too, and I knew their company had a strict policy against workplace relationships. It didn't take long for the fallout to hit. By Friday afternoon, Diane was sitting in the kitchen, clutching a termination letter from her employer. "Did you do this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. I didn't even try to deny it. "Actions have consequences," I said coolly. "You ruined my career," she shouted, tears streaming down her face. "No," I said, my voice calm. "You ruined your career when you decided to screw around with someone at work. Don't blame me for cleaning up your mess." Her anger dissolved into sobs, and she sank into the chair, burying her face in her hands. I stood there for a moment, watching her break down. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of victory. Just a cold, hollow certainty that I was doing what needed to be done. By the end of the week, Diane packed her things and moved in with her sister. The house was quiet again, but this time, it felt different. The weight of betrayal still lingered, but I could finally see a path forward. It wasn't over yet, there were still legal battles to fight, custody arrangements to finalize, and emotional wounds to heal. But for the first time in months, I felt like I had control over my life again. The house was nearly empty now. Diane's things were gone, packed up into the back of her sister's SUV 3 days earlier. The silence felt heavier than before, but at least it was honest. There were no more lies hanging in the air, no unspoken truths hiding behind polite smiles. The kids had gone to stay with my parents for the weekend. I wanted them out of the house for this final conversation. Diane was coming back, but not to reconcile. We both knew that was impossible now. This meeting was about logistics, how to move forward with the divorce, custody arrangements, and the legal mess that her affair had left behind. But for me, it was more than that. It was about closure. She arrived just after 3 p.m. I watched from the window as her car pulled into the driveway. She sat there for a moment, staring at the steering wheel, before finally stepping out. She looked drained, her usual confidence replaced by a hesitant uncertainty. She knocked, even though she still had the key, and I opened the door without a word. "Hi," she said softly, her voice tentative. "Come in," I said, stepping aside to let her pass. We sat in the dining room, a pile of documents spread out on the table between us. She picked up the custody agreement first, her hands trembling slightly as she read through it. I had made it clear in the paperwork that I wanted full custody, and while I expected resistance, she surprised me. "I don't want to fight you on this," she said quietly, setting the papers down. "The kids deserve stability, and I know I can't give them that right now." Her voice was steady, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. "No tricks, no dragging this out in court later?" She shook her head. "I've put them through enough, Matt. I just want what's best for them." Her answer was surprising, almost disarming. But I didn't let my guard down. "Good," I said. "Then let's talk about the rest of it." For the next hour, we went over everything: the division of assets, her plans to stay with her sister until she could find a place of her own, how we would handle birthdays and holidays for the kids. She agreed to everything without much pushback, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of the woman I once knew, someone who cared, who wanted to do the right thing. But it wasn't enough. When the paperwork was finally done, I leaned back in my chair and crossed my arms. "There's one thing I still don't understand," I said, my voice calm but firm. She looked up, her expression wary. "What's that?" "Why?" I asked, holding her gaze. "Why him? Why now? Was it just about me? About us? Or was there something else?" Diane sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Matt, I've asked myself that question 100 times since this all started. I wish I had a simple answer for you, but I don't." "Try," I said flatly. She nodded, taking a deep breath. "It wasn't about you," she began. "At least, not entirely." I felt stuck. Like my life wasn't mine anymore. It was about the kids, the house, the bills, your work. I felt invisible. Her voice wavered as she spoke, but she pushed on. "He paid attention to me. He made me feel like I mattered, like I was more than just a mom and a wife. I know that doesn't excuse what I did, but it's the truth." I listened, my expression unreadable. "So instead of talking to me, you decided to blow up our entire life for someone who made you feel seen." Diane flinched at the harshness of my words. "I know I should have talked to you. I know I should have done a lot of things differently. But at the time, I wasn't thinking straight. I didn't see another way." "There's always another way," I said firmly. "You just didn't want to take it." She opened her mouth to argue but stopped herself, nodding instead. "You're right," she admitted. "I was selfish. I let my own feelings cloud everything else, and now I'm paying for it. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her confession hanging between us. Finally, she looked at me, her eyes pleading. Matt, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I need you to know that I am sorry for all of it. For what I did to you, to the kids. I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I studied her for a long moment, my emotions a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and something resembling pity. I don't hate you, Diane, I said finally. But I can't forgive you, either. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Her face crumpled, but she nodded. I understand. She stood, gathering her things. I should go, she said quietly. Thank you for letting me explain. I didn't respond, watching as she walked to the door. She paused, her hand on the doorknob, and turned back to face me one last time. For what it's worth, she said softly, I hope you find someone who gives you the love you deserve. And with that, she was gone. I sat there for a long time after she left, staring at the empty chair where she had been. The anger, the betrayal, it was all still there, simmering beneath the surface. But for the first time in months, I also felt a glimmer of something else, closure. This was the end of us. But maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something new for me. The days following Diane's departure were surreal. The house felt emptier than ever, though it still carried the weight of what had happened. The kids returned on Monday morning, and I sat them down once again, this time to explain the new arrangements. I kept it simple, your mom and I are separating, and she's staying with Aunt Lisa for now. You'll still see her on weekends or whenever you want, but for now, you'll live here with me. They had questions, of course. My daughter wanted to know if her mom would ever come back. My son asked why things couldn't stay the same. It broke my heart to explain to them that this wasn't something that could be fixed, that our family had already been torn apart. Will you still talk to her? My son finally asked, his voice quiet. I'll always talk to her, I said. She's still your mom, and we'll work together to make sure you're both okay. But things between us, they're over. My daughter cried, and my son nodded solemnly, like he understood more than he let on. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had some measure of control over my life. My lawyer confirmed that Diane had signed the initial custody agreement, which granted me primary custody of the kids. The divorce papers were moving through the system, and while there was still plenty of legal red tape to cut through, the hardest part was over. But even as the pieces began falling into place, the emotional fallout lingered. Nights were the worst. I'd sit in the living room after the kids went to bed, staring at the walls, replaying every moment that led us here. Diane's excuses, her apologies, her betrayal, they all churned in my mind like a storm I couldn't quiet. I'd thought confronting her and exposing her lies would bring me some kind of satisfaction, some closure. And to a degree, it had. But it also left a void, a nagging emptiness that was harder to face than the anger. It wasn't just about Diane anymore. It was about what her actions had taken from me, the trust, the sense of stability, the belief that our life together had meant something. I forced myself to focus on the practical. The house needed to feel like mine again, not a relic of a broken marriage. I started with small things, repainting the bedroom, changing the sheets, throwing out the coffee mugs Diane always insisted on keeping even though they were chipped. Then I moved on to bigger changes. The living room got a new couch, the kids helped me pick out a fresh rug, and I even swapped out the family photos on the walls for ones of just the three of us. It wasn't about erasing Diane, it was about reclaiming our space, building something new out of what she had left behind. One evening, about 3 weeks after Diane left, I sat down with my kids for dinner. It was a simple meal, spaghetti and garlic bread, but it felt special in a way I couldn't quite explain. We talked about school, their friends, the little things that had nothing to do with the storm we'd been through. For the first time in a while, there was laughter at the table. My son told a joke so bad it made his sister groan, and I couldn't stop laughing. It hit me then, this was what mattered. Not Diane, not her betrayal, not the life we used to have. This. The kids, their laughter, the moments we shared. After dinner, as I cleaned up the dishes, my daughter came into the kitchen and hugged me. Thanks, Dad, she said. For what? I asked, surprised. For being here, she said simply. It was a small moment, but it meant everything. I wish I could say the pain disappeared after that, but life doesn't work that way. Healing is a process, and some wounds take longer to close than others. Diane and I still had to navigate co-parenting, and while our interactions were civil, they were far from warm. She tried to reach out a few times, sending me long messages about how sorry she was and how much she regretted her choices. I didn't respond. I wasn't interested in reopening that door. My focus was on the kids, on rebuilding our life together. By the time the divorce was finalized, things had settled into a new kind of normal. The kids spent every other weekend with Diane, and while they seemed to enjoy their time with her, they were always happy to come back home. I started going out more, reconnecting with old friends and making new ones. It wasn't about finding someone new, at least, not yet. It was about rediscovering who I was outside of my marriage, outside of the roles Diane had assigned to me over the years. I found joy in simple things, fixing up the house, taking the kids on day trips, cooking meals that didn't involve Diane's overly complicated recipes. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. A few months later, I ran into Kevin, the neighbor who had started this whole chain of events with his revelation. He looked hesitant, almost apologetic, as he approached me in the driveway. I never got the chance to say I'm sorry, he said, scratching the back of his neck. I know it wasn't my place to get involved. I shook my head. Don't apologize, I said. You did the right thing. If you hadn't said anything, I might still be in the dark. He nodded, looking relieved. How are you holding up? Better than I thought I'd be, I admitted. It's been rough, but we're getting through it. We stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unspoken between us. Then he clapped me on the shoulder. You're a good guy, Matt, he said. Don't forget that. As I watched him walk back to his house, I realized something. He was right. I was a good guy. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. Life hadn't turned out the way I planned, but it was far from over. And that, I decided, was enough.